Just ing. Something has shifted in this case, and it centers around a piece of footage the public was never supposed to be talking about. A missing SD card, a TPUSA cameraman, and a reaction from Erika Kirk that has stopped a lot of people mid-sentence. Because here's the thing when new evidence is alleged to exist. Especially video evidence. The story doesn't move forward quietly. It fractures. It raises questions. And it forces attention back to moments some people would rather stay buried. If this footage exists, why wasn't it logged? If it doesn't exist, why is there so much tension around it? Before we go any further, take a second, like this video, share it, subscribe to this channel, and comment below. Tell me what you think this development means and where you're watching from. Your engagement helps keep these conversations visible when others want them shut down. Because in true crime, the story doesn't usually unravel with a confession. It unravels with reactions. And this reaction is drawing attention for a reason. Up to this point, the public narrative surrounding this case has been relatively fixed. Erika Kirk is the widow of Charlie Kirk, who was fatally shot during a public event. In the immediate aftermath, official statements emphasized that the situation was contained, that the response was handled, and that there was no broader threat to the public. Law enforcement and federal authorities presented the incident as isolated, tragic, and fully understood. Security was present. Media was present. Cameras were rolling. And for most viewers, that was where the story was expected to end. Over time, questions began to surface, not accusations, but procedural questions. Questions about security response. Questions about visibility. Questions about what was captured on camera and what wasn't. Each time, the message from official channels and close affiliates was consistent. The public had enough information, and further scrutiny was unnecessary. Until now. Because recently, attention shifted to a new claim involving a TPUSA cameraman. According to public statements circulating online, this cameraman allegedly recorded footage on an SD card that has not been publicly released and may no longer be accounted for. That claim alone doesn't establish wrongdoing. Missing footage can happen for many reasons. Cards get mislabeled. Files get corrupted. Equipment gets reused. None of that is unusual in media environments. What is unusual is what followed. The discussion didn't stay focused on the footage itself. Instead, it triggered a visible emotional response. Statements were made. Lines were drawn. And suddenly, a technical issue and SD card became a flashpoint. That's where this story moves from background noise into active scrutiny. Because in cases like this, it's not just about what evidence exists. It's about how people respond when the possibility of evidence is raised. Let's slow this down and separate fact from claim, because that distinction matters. What is being discussed publicly right now is an allegation made by a TPUSA cameraman that footage was recorded on an SD card on the day of the shooting, and that this SD card is now missing or unaccounted for. At this time, there is no publicly released inventory, no official chain of custody document, and no independent verification confirming what exactly was on that card, where it went or when it was last seen. That's not an accusation. That's simply the current state of public information. It's important to say this clearly. A missing SD card does not automatically mean evidence was hidden. It does not automatically mean footage was deleted. And it does not automatically mean anyone acted with intent. But in high-profile cases involving violence, video footage is not just media, it's documentation. It captures timelines, positioning, reactions, and context that written reports often can't. That's why questions are being asked. The most basic ones. Was the footage logged? Was the SD card tagged and secured? Who last had possession of it? Was the footage reviewed by investigators? And if it was, why hasn't it been clearly stated? These are not hostile questions. They're procedural questions. In any professional, media, or investigative environment, especially one involving a fatal incident, raw footage is typically preserved, cataloged, and documented regardless of whether it's ever released publicly. What's driving attention here is not just the claim that footage is missing, but the absence of a clear, calm explanation addressing those process questions. Instead of clarification, what the public saw next was escalation. And that brings us to Erika Kirk's response, not her grief. Not her loss, but her public behavior in the face of these questions. What followed the SD card discussion wasn't a technical clarification or a procedural breakdown. It was an emotional response. Publicly, Erika Kirk appeared visibly agitated. Her statements were forceful. The tone was sharp. And the message was clear: people needed to stop asking questions. Now, this is where true crime analysis requires discipline. Grief can look like anger. Shock can look like defensiveness. And no one gets to dictate how a person processes loss. But behavioral analysis doesn't focus on emotion alone. It focuses on direction. What stood out to observers was not that Erika reacted, but who she reacted toward, and what she reacted against. The frustration was not aimed at institutions, not at security leadership, not at investigators or agencies responsible for evidence handling. Instead, it was aimed at the public, at independent commentators, at people asking procedural questions about footage. Redirection matters. Because in high-profile cases, the most common demand from family members is clarity, clear timelines, clear accountability, and clear answers from those in charge. When those questions are redirected away from systems and toward civilians, analysts take note. Again, this doesn't imply intent. It doesn't imply wrongdoing. But it does create contrast, especially when the response appears disproportionate to the question being asked. The question wasn't who did this. The question was, where is the footage? And instead of de-escalation, what followed was escalation. That shift away from process and toward suppression is what moved this moment from background noise into a focal point. Because when reactions grow louder than the questions themselves, it suggests pressure. And pressure doesn't come from curiosity. It comes from stakes. To understand why this response resonated the way it did, we have to place it into context, because this isn't happening in isolation. To understand why this moment landed the way it did, you have to look at it as part of a sequence, not a standalone incident. This isn't the first time questions surrounding this case have been met with resistance. It's not the first time attention has shifted away from process. And it's not the first time public scrutiny has been framed as inappropriate or harmful. Each time, new questions surfaced about security, about timelines, about behavior. The response followed a similar arc. First, reassurance, then dismissal, and finally, frustration directed outward. That repetition is what analysts pay attention to. Because in true crime, a single reaction doesn't mean much. But consistent reactions to different questions can indicate a stress point in the narrative. The SD card claim didn't introduce a new theory. It didn't accuse anyone of wrongdoing. It didn't reinterpret the event. It simply reopened the issue of documentation. And yet, The response to it was immediate and intense. That tells us something not about guilt, but about sensitivity. Sensitive narratives tend to form around details that are either unresolved, poorly explained, or difficult to reconcile with the official story. When a detail threatens to pull attention back to those unresolved areas, it often triggers an attempt to shut the conversation down. Again, this is not unique to this case. It's a pattern seen repeatedly in high-profile incidents. What makes this moment different is timing. This reaction came after months of public discussion, after repeated calls to move on, and after assurances that nothing further needed to be examined. And yet, a single claim about missing footage was enough to reignite visible tension. That's why this isn't being dismissed as internet noise. Because the response itself became evidence not of a crime, but of discomfort. And discomfort raises a new question. Why does this footage matter so much? To answer that, we need to talk about the role of video evidence in cases like this and why its absence carries weight, even when no wrongdoing is proven. In true crime analysis, video footage holds a unique position. It doesn't speculate. It doesn't interpret. It records. Raw footage captures details that often go unnoticed in real time: who was standing where, how quickly people reacted, what directions attention shifted, and what happened in the moments before and after an incident. Even footage that seems mundane can become critical later. Not because it proves something, but because it anchors timelines. That's why, in professional investigations, video evidence is treated with care regardless of whether it's ever shown to the public. The issue here is not entertainment. It's process. When footage is alleged to exist, standard questions follow automatically. Was it preserved? Was it reviewed? Was it logged? Those steps protect everyone involved, from investigators to witnesses to family members. They prevent confusion later. They prevent speculation from filling gaps. When those steps aren't clearly communicated, uncertainty takes their place. And uncertainty is where narratives fracture. It's also important to understand that missing or unreleased footage does not mean something nefarious occurred. Footage can be withheld for legal reasons. It can be deemed irrelevant. It can be retained as part of an ongoing review. All of those are valid. What changes the dynamic is silence. Not silence in the immediate aftermath, but prolonged silence once questions become public and specific. When no clear explanation is offered, the absence becomes louder than any statement. That's why this SD card issue didn't fade away. Not because of what people think it contains, but because of what hasn't been said about it. And that leads to the next issue. Because while attention has been directed toward critics and commentators, there are key questions that haven't been addressed by the people or institutions best positioned to answer them. As this discussion has unfolded, one thing has remained consistent. The people most capable of clarifying the situation haven't done so, at least not publicly. There has been no detailed statement explaining whether the alleged SD card footage was logged. No confirmation of whether it was reviewed. No clarification on who last had possession of it. And no timeline offered to resolve the discrepancy. Instead, the conversation has largely been redirected toward discouraging further questions altogether. That's where accountability comes into focus. In high-profile cases involving loss of life, accountability doesn't require blame, it requires transparency. Clear answers don't inflame speculation. They usually shut it down. When basic procedural questions go unanswered, they create a vacuum that others attempt to fill. This isn't about demanding privileged information. It's about acknowledging process. A simple statement outlining what was done with recorded footage would address much of the public concern. Even a confirmation that footage exists but cannot be released for specific reasons would establish boundaries. The absence of that clarity is what stands out, especially when the responsibility for evidence handling typically lies not with families or commentators, but with organizations, production teams, and investigative bodies. When those entities remain quiet, attention naturally shifts not because people want drama, but because unanswered questions persist. And this is where it's important to slow down and be precise. Because despite the intensity of discussion, there are several things that are not being claimed. Clarifying that matters. Before this goes any further, it's important to be absolutely clear about what is not being alleged here. There is no confirmed evidence that footage was intentionally destroyed. There is no proof that anyone acted with malicious intent. There is no verified claim that the missing SD card contains information that contradicts the official narrative. And there is no accusation being made against Erika Kirk or any specific individual. Asking questions about process is not the same as assigning blame. True crime analysis depends on restraint. It requires acknowledging uncertainty instead of filling gaps with assumptions. The focus here remains on procedures, responses, and transparency, not conclusions. Missing footage, if it exists, could be the result of something mundane. A clerical error, a technical issue, a miscommunication. Those possibilities matter just as much as any other. What makes this situation notable is not the absence of proof, it's the absence of explanation. And that distinction is critical. Because when observers raise concerns about documentation or evidence handling, they're not asserting guilt. They're asking for clarity. Clarity protects reputations. It stabilizes narratives. And it prevents speculation from spiraling. That's why this conversation persists. Not because people are determined to believe something sinister, but because the mechanisms that usually close these discussions haven't been engaged. Which leads to the larger question. Why does this story keep resurfacing, even when people are told to move on? The answer isn't outrage. It's trust. Stories like this don't persist because of curiosity alone. They persist when trust breaks down. In high-profile cases, public trust is maintained through consistent communication, clear process, and visible accountability. When those elements are present, attention fades naturally. When they're not, questions resurface sometimes louder than before. What's happening here isn't unique. It follows a pattern seen again and again in true crime history. When people are told that asking questions is harmful, irresponsible, or disrespectful, the effect is rarely silence. More often, it creates resistance. Because transparency de-escalates, and suppression escalates. The reaction to the SD card discussion shifted focus away from the footage itself and onto the response to it. That shift is why the story gained traction. Not because new evidence was confirmed, but because the reaction suggested that the conversation itself was unacceptable. That creates a paradox. If there is nothing more to clarify, then clarification costs nothing. If there are no procedural issues, then explaining the process resolves concern. When neither happens, attention remains. This isn't about distrust of individuals. It's about confidence in systems. Systems earn confidence when they show their work. And until that happens, stories like this continue to circulate, not driven by speculation, but by unresolved process questions. Which brings us to the final part of this analysis. Not conclusions. Not accusations. Just questions. So this is where we leave it. Not with answers but with questions that remain unanswered. If footage was recorded, where is it now? If it was reviewed, why hasn't it been clearly stated? If it was deemed irrelevant, why not explain why? And if it never existed at all, why has that not been addressed directly? Why does a procedural question about an SD card provoke such a strong reaction? Why is public scrutiny being framed as a problem instead of a process? And why are the people best positioned to clarify the issue choosing silence? None of these questions accuse anyone of wrongdoing. They don't assign motive. They don't rewrite the official narrative. They simply ask for transparency. Because history has shown us something important. When people are told to stop asking questions, the questions don't disappear. They grow. They spread. And they return with more attention than before. So the real question now isn't about a missing SD card. It's about trust. And whether transparency will be used to restore it or avoid it until the story grows louder. I'll leave you with that. And I want to know what you think. Does this situation sit right with you? Or does it raise questions you can't ignore? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm Detective B, if you're fascinated by real life, mysteries, and criminal investigations. Tap like, subscribe, and share your opinion in the comments. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you think about today's case. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant. And remember, in true crime, the line between fact and perception is often thinner than we realize.